The classroom smelled like recycled air and cold metal, and it was full of students from every corner of the galaxy. Tivan clicked his sharp crystal legs against the floor as he walked to his seat near the front row. He was Valesi and proud of. And his body was covered in a hard, shining exoskeleton that could stop a blade, and his mind was sharper than any blade. His people did not cry. They did not scream. They considered pain to be a small inconvenience, like a cloud passing in front of. The summer sat 2 rows behind him and took up 3 seats because of his massive size. He was Gorvan and built like a living fortress. His skin was thick plated armor, and beneath it, his muscles were dense enough to crush stone. His people were warriors born in fire and blood. A Gorvan child could take a hit that would kill most species and laugh about it. Ladder sat near the window, if you could call it a window. It was actually a long transparent panel that showed the stars outside. The station. She was Delvari, and her skin glowed faintly with soft blue and purple light. Her people could feel the emotions of others like heat from a flame. She was quiet and gentle, and she did not like loud places. But today something else was making her uncomfortable. Someone was sitting alone in the very last row at the back of the room. He was human. His name was Kael Vasquez, and he had enrolled late, and nobody knew much about him. He was not tall and not short. He was not loud and not friendly. He had dark hair cut short, and there were scars on his hands and neck and the left side of his jaw. The scars were old and pale, and looked like they had been earned in places where no one could hear you scream. He sat perfectly still, not the kind of still where someone is relaxed. No. This was the kind of still where someone has trained their body to stop moving because movement once meant pain. Professor Almoran floated to the front of the room inside his containment suit. He was Keth, which meant his true body was a swirling cloud of silver gas. The suit gave him shape and voice, and he had been teaching at the Galactic Union Academy for over 300 years. Today, he said in his deep, echoing voice, we discuss pain. A few students shifted in their seats. Pain, he continued, is the most universal experience in biology. Every species with a nervous system has some version of it, but not all species experience it equally. He activated the display behind him, and a massive chart appeared showing the nerve density of dozens of species across the galaxy. Humans, he said, tapping the chart. Here, dot representing humans, was near the very top. Devon made a clicking sound with his mandibles, which was the Valesi version of a snort. He raised one sharp claw and spoke without waiting to be called on. Professor, he said with full respect, this data must be misleading. Humans are known throughout the galaxy for their dramatic reactions to pain. They scream over small cuts. They cry over bruises. They take chemicals to dull sensations that my species would not even notice. I have seen recordings. If anything, the data suggests that humans have high nerve density, but extremely low tolerance. Several students laughed. Rith let out a rumbling grunt of agreement. A Gorvan warrior can lose a limb in battle and continue fighting, he said in his deep, gravelly voice. I have seen humans weep over a broken finger. They are soft creatures. No offense to any humans present day. Few heads turned toward the back row. Kael did not move. He did not react. He did not even blink. Professor Almoran was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was lower and more serious. You confuse expression with weakness. He said slowly, humans do not exaggerate pain. They simply do not hide it. There is a profound difference. A human who screams when they are hurt is being honest with you. They are telling you exactly what they feel. He paused. And those who learn to hide it, he added, those who go quiet. You should pray you never meet one at Tivan. Clicked dismissively, respectfully. Professor, I believe this is sentimental exaggeration. Pain is pain. The species that handles it best is the one that reacts least. That is biology, not poetry. Professor Almoran looked at Tavan for a long moment, and then looked past him toward the back of the room, toward the humans sitting in silence. Perhaps, he said, you will have a chance to test that theory. The class ended and students began filing out. Tavan walked with Reth and both of them were still laughing quietly about the lecture. Humans, they agreed, were emotional, fragile, and overrated. Shoah did not laugh. She gathered her things slowly and then did something she had not planned to do. She walked toward the back of the room. Kael was still sitting there. He was putting a single data pad into a warm bag, and his movements were slow and careful. The way someone moves when every joint aches, but they have stopped caring about it. "Hello," she said softly. "My name is Sil." He looked up at her. His eyes were dark and calm, and there was something behind them that she could not read. Not anger, not sadness, something heavier. "Kael," he said. She reached out her hand in the human greeting she had studied, and he looked at it for a second before taking it. The moment their skin touched, Silha felt it. It hit her like a wall of fire pain. Not sharp and sudden like a wound, but deep and constant, and enormous like an ocean with no bottom. It was everywhere. It was in his bones and his skin and his muscles and his nerves. It was old and layered like rock built up over time, and it was not fading. It was not healing. It was just there, always burning, always present, like the background hum of a dying star. Silha gasped and pulled her hand back. Her bioluminescence flickered wildly, shifting from blue to white to dark to nothing at all. Her legs nearly gave out, and she grabbed the edge of a desk to steady herself. Her eyes were wide and wet, and her breath was shaking. Kael looked at her, and there was no surprise on his face, no confusion. He had seen this before. He knew what she had felt. He tilted his head slightly. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was calm and kind, and that was the worst part, because Silha now understood that the pain she had felt from him was not a spike or a flash. It was his normal. It was what he lived inside every single second of every single day. And he was asking if she was okay. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Her glow had gone completely dark, which among the Delvari was the deepest expression of sorrow and fear. Kael picked up his bag and stood. He gave her a small nod that was almost gentle and walked out of the room. Silha stood alone in the empty classroom, shaking. She had felt the emotions of hundreds of beings in her life. She had felt grief and rage and terror and joy and love. But she had never felt anything like what lived inside that human. It was not that he was broken. It was that he had been broken so many times and so completely that his mind had rebuilt itself around the pain, like a city built on the edge of a volcano, and the volcano had never stopped burning. The simulation chamber was massive. It stretched out in every direction like a real jungle, thick with dark trees, hanging vines, and air so humid it stuck to your skin. The ground was soft and wet, and things moved in the shadows. Things with teeth. Professor Almarin had assigned teams of 4 for the survival practical navigate the jungle, collect biological samples, and return to the extraction point in 6 hours. Anyone who failed would lose a full-grade. Kael was placed on a team with Tivan Reth, and Silha was not happy about it. "The human will slow us down," he said to Reth as they stood at the entrance to the simulation. His mandibles clicked in irritation. "We will have to carry him through the difficult sections." Reth grunted in agreement. He crossed his massive arms and looked at Kael the way a boulder might look at a pebble, not with hatred, just with the quiet certainty that the smaller thing did not matter. Silha said nothing. She stood slightly apart from the group, and she had not stopped watching Kael since the moment they had gathered. Her bioluminescence was dim and uneasy. She had not told anyone what she had felt when she touched his hand 2 days ago. She did not know how to explain it. She was not sure she wanted to. Kael stood at the edge of the group with his bag over one shoulder. He did not argue with Tivan. He did not try to prove himself. He just waited. "Let's go," said Reth, and they entered the jungle. The first hour went well. Reth led the way, smashing through thick vegetation with his armored body. Tivan moved quickly on his 6 crystal legs, scanning for samples with his sharp, compound eyes. They collected 3 specimens within the first 40 minutes, and Tivan was already calculating their route to the extraction point. Kael walked behind them and said almost nothing, but Scylla noticed things. She noticed that when Tavan walked under a low-hanging branch covered in tiny barbed thorns, Kael reached up and held the branch aside without being asked. She noticed that when Reth stepped over a patch of ground that looked solid, Kael went around it, and a minute later the patch collapsed into a sinkhole. She noticed that Kael never looked at the ground. He looked at the trees, at the canopy, at the shadows. He read the jungle the way Scylla read emotions, quietly, carefully, like his life had once depended on it. The second hour brought trouble. The jungle got thicker and darker, and the sounds changed, the ambient noises of insects, and birds went silent, and that silence was heavy. Reth stopped. "Something is here," he rumbled. Tavan raised his sensor. "My scanner is not detecting any." It came from above a Kethra stalker. It was a simulation of one of the most dangerous predators in the known galaxy. A long serpentine body covered in black scales with 6 limbs tipped in electrified barbs. It dropped from the canopy like a falling nightmare, and it landed directly on Kael. The barbs punched into his left arm, 3 of them deep into the muscle, and the electric charge fired. The system registered it as a level 7 pain event, which was enough to knock most species to the ground. Screaming of Valesi would have curled into a defensive ball. A Delvari would have blacked out. Even a Gorvan would have roared. Kael did not scream. He did not fall. He looked down at the creature attached to his arm the way someone might look at a piece of dirt on their sleeve. Then he reached over with his free hand, found the spot just behind the creature's head where the nerve cluster sat, and he crushed it. The creature went limp. Kael pulled the barbs out of his own arm one by one, slowly and deliberately. Blood ran down his forearm and dripped off his fingers onto the wet ground. Each barb made a soft wet sound as it came free, and each one must have sent a fresh wave of agony through his already damaged nerves. He did not flinch, not on Tavan. His mandibles were open and his compound eyes were locked on the human. He had frozen completely, which was something Valesi only did when they encountered a threat they could not calculate. Reth had taken a step back. His massive plated body shifted and his claws flexed at his sides. It was instinct, the deep ancient instinct of a predator. Recognizing something that was not prey, Scylla felt it all. She felt the pain hit Kael like a thunderbolt. She felt his nervous system light up with agony, from his fingers to his shoulder, to his spine, to his brain. The pain was real and immense and brutal, but beneath it was the other thing, the old thing she had felt when she touched his hand. It was a pain so deep and so constant and so enormous that this new wound, this level 7 shock that would have destroyed anyone else, was nothing to it. It was a candle flame thrown into a bonfire. It was a drop of water falling into an ocean. Kael's body knew pain the way a fish knows water. He lived in it. He moved through it. He had built his entire existence on top of it. And this was just Tuesday. He tore a strip from his sleeve and wrapped his arm tightly, pulling the knot with his teeth. His face was calm. His breathing was steady. "We should keep moving," he said. He said it the way someone might say it looks like rain. Simple. Casual, almost bored. "Will attract scavengers," he added. They moved. Nobody spoke for the rest of the practical. When they reached the extraction point, they had all their samples, and they had the fastest completion time of any team. Tavan noted this, but did not say it out loud. He was too busy replaying the image of a human pulling electrified barbs out of his own flesh without making a sound. At the medical bay, afterward, the technician scanned Kael's arm, and when still her face changed, and she called in the senior physicist. Antivan was outside in the corridor. He had told himself he was waiting for his own scan results, but the truth was, he wanted to know. He needed to know. The door was not fully closed, and voices carried third degree nerve damage in the forearm. The physician said, "How is he even using this hand?" "There are old fractures," the technician replied. "Dozens of them, healed, but not properly. Some of these look like they were set manually, without surgical assistance." The physician was quiet for a moment. The scar tissue, she said slowly, it is everywhere. His skin, his muscles, his internal organs. This man has been through something. I have never seen a medical file like this in 30 years. Stevan stood in the corridor and for the first time in his life, his exoskeleton trembled. He had laughed at humans in that lecture hall. He had called them dramatic and weak and primitive, but now he stood outside a medical bay, listening to doctors try to understand how a human being could walk and talk and function while carrying inside his body the evidence of a suffering so vast that the word pain did not even begin to cover it. Ivan looked down at his own crystal body. He had never been scratched. He had never been broken. He had never known a single moment of true agony. And somewhere on the other side of that door, a human was sitting calmly while doctors stared at his scans in horror. And that human had asked Stella if she was okay. Tivan's legs felt weak beneath him, and he leaned against the wall and stayed there for a very long time. Word spread fast. By the next morning, everyone at the Galactic Union Academy had heard some version of the story. A human took a level 7 hit and did not react. A human pulled barbs out of his own arm like he was removing splinters. A human bled all over the jungle floor and then told his team to keep moving. Some students were fascinated. Some were disturbed. Some refused to believe it is defective, said a Thesari student in the dining hall, her aquatic fins rippling with disgust. His pain receptors must be damaged. He probably cannot feel anything. Tivan heard this and said nothing, which was unusual for him because Tivan always had something to say. He sat at his table and pushed food around his plate and stared at the surface like it held some secret. He had not slept. Instead, he had spent the entire night in the Academy library searching through the human medical and psychological database. He did not know what he was looking for at first, but the deeper he went, the more he found, and the more he found, the less he understood chronic pain syndrome, a condition where the human nervous system becomes trapped in a loop of constant pain signals even after the original injury has healed. The brain never stops screaming, even when there is nothing left to scream about. Pain dissociation, a survival mechanism where the human mind learns to separate itself from pain, not to stop feeling it but to function on top of it, to build a wall between the agony and the ability to move and think and act. Trauma-induced analgesia, the brain flooding itself with chemicals during extreme events to suppress pain temporarily. But the pain always comes back. Tivan read case after case, and his mandibles hung open. Humans did not lose the ability to feel pain. That was the thing that shook him to his crystal core. Other species developed thick skin or numbing agents, or simply had fewer nerve endings. Humans had none of that. They had the highest nerve density in the galaxy, and they felt everything. Everything. Those who endured prolonged suffering did not become numb. They became something else. Their brains learned to carry the pain like a weight, to keep walking under it, to keep thinking inside it. They did not escape it. They simply refused to let it stop them. There was no Valesi equivalent for this in Valesi culture. Pain was a problem to be solved. If something hurt, you fixed it or you removed it. The idea of living inside pain, of building your life on a foundation of agony, was not just foreign. It was unthinkable, but humans did it, millions of them, every day. Earth was going through his own transformation, though he would never have used that word in Gorvan culture. Warriors were ranked by what they could endure. A warrior who lost a limb and kept fighting was honored. A warrior who endured torture and did not break was legendary. But all of those warriors eventually healed. Their pain ended. Their bodies recovered. Kael's pain had not ended. Earth had seen the way Kael moved, the stiffness in his left hand, the slight unevenness in his walk, the way he sometimes paused for just half a second before sitting down, as if bracing himself for what his body was about to feel. These were not the signs of someone who had been hurt once. These were the signs of someone who was being hurt right now, constantly, every moment of every day. And he still got up every morning. He still attended class. He still functioned in Gorvan terms that was not bravery. That was something. Beyond bravery, that was terrifying. Scylla found Kael on the observation deck 3 nights after the practical. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the cold wall and his legs stretched out in front of him. The stars moved slowly past the window and their light was the only thing illuminating his face. He looked tired. Not sleepy tired, but the kind of tired that goes deeper than bones. The kind that settles into the soul. She sat down next to him, and for a while, neither of them spoke. "What happened to you?" she asked finally. He did not look at her. She thought he would not answer, and she was prepared for that. She would not push him. She was Delvari, and her people understood that some doors should only be opened from the inside. But then, he spoke. His voice was flat and calm, like someone reading a report. Not emotional, not dramatic. "Just facts. I was a salvage operator," he said. "Deep space. We worked the outer systems, pulling apart old wrecks and abandoned stations for parts. My ship was called the Cairn Crew of 12. He paused. "Reactor breach," he said. "Uncharted system. No com relays. No nearby stations." The explosion killed 8 of the crew instantly. 3 more died in the next 2 days from radiation and injury. Scylla as glow dim die. "Survived," he said. He looked at his left hand and flexed it slowly. It moved, but not well. The knuckles were thick with scar tissue, and 2 of the fingers did not bend all the way. "Burns across 40% of my body. Shattered spine, crushed hand. The medical bay on the ship was barely functional. It could keep me alive, but the pain management systems were destroyed in the blast." He stopped and took a slow breath. "I drifted for 11 months. He said. Scylla felt the air leave her lungs. 11 months. Alone, in a broken ship. In pain, no painkillers, he said, as if reading her mind. Nothing. The medbay could seal wounds and set bones, but that was it. Every burn, every fracture, every piece of damaged nerve, I felt all of it. All the time." He spoke the next part with the same flat voice, but Scylla could feel the weight of it pressing down on the air around them like gravity. "Increasing. I set my own bones," he said. "I cleaned my own burns with tools that were not meant for it. I taught myself to walk again. After my spine was repaired, because there was no one to help me, I had to keep the ship running, or the life support would fail, and I would die. So I worked through it. Every day I woke up in pain. I worked in pain. I tried to sleep in pain, and the next day, I did it again. 11 months, he repeated quietly. When they found me at Galactic Union Patrol, a Delvari medic came on board to assess me. She touched my hand the way you did." He looked at Scylla, collapsed. He said they had to sedate her. Scylla's bioluminescence had gone completely dark. Her eyes were wet, and her hands were trembling in her lap. She could not speak. She did not trust her voice. Kael watched her for a moment, and there was something in his eyes that was almost soft, almost kind. "I am not brave," he said. "I just ran out of ways to react." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "When your body has been screaming for 11 months, and no one is coming, and nothing is changing, you do not become strong. You just become quiet. The screaming does not stop. You just stop hearing it the way you stop hearing a noise that never turns off." Scylla wiped her eyes. "Does it still hurt?" She whispered. He looked back at the stars. "Every second of every day," he said. She reached out and took his hand. This time she was ready for it. The wave of pain hit her, and it was still enormous, still overwhelming, still the deepest, darkest ocean she had ever touched. But she held on. She did not pull away. She let her glow return. Slowly, a soft, warm light, and she sat there with him in the dark. They did not speak. They did not need to. Outside the observation window, the stars kept turning, and somewhere in the vast black silence of space, a broken ship called the Cairn was still drifting, carrying the ghost of 11 months that had turned a man into something the galaxy had never seen before. In the corridor outside, Tavan stood frozen. He had come to find Kael to ask him a question about the practical, but the door had been open, and he had heard everything. His exoskeleton was trembling, not from cold, not from anger, from The understanding that he had laughed at a species whose weakest members endured more in a single lifetime than his people had endured in 1,000 years. He turned and walked away in silence, and the sound of his crystal legs on the metal floor was the loneliest sound in the station. The pain demonstration was a tradition at the academy. Every year, students were given the chance to sit in the neural calibration chair and receive a standardized pain stimulus. It was safe-controlled and monitored by 3 medical technicians. The device sent a signal directly to the nervous system, bypassing the skin and the muscles and hitting the brain with pure, clean pain at whatever level was. Selected level 1 was discomfort, like a pinch. Level 5 was significant, like a bone-breaking level. 10 was the maximum. It had never been used on a living subject at the academy. It was labeled on the device as catastrophic tissue destruction equivalent, and it existed only for calibration purposes. The demonstration was voluntary, but among the warrior species, it was a point of pride. Gorvan students especially treated it like a competition. The one who endured the highest level with the least reaction earned respect that lasted the rest of their time at the academy. The hall was packed. Every seat was taken, and students were standing along the walls. Species from every part of the galaxy had come to watch. The air buzzed with anticipation and tension, and the smell of 100 different biologies mixing together. Reth volunteered first. He walked to the chair like a mountain moving. His thick-plated body settled into the seat, and his massive arms rested on the armrests. The technician calibrated the device and looked at him level. He asked 5, said Reth. The device activated. Reth grunted. His blades flexed and his jaw tightened, and a low rumbling sound came from deep in his chest. But he held. He did not move. He did not cry out. After 10 seconds, the device shut off and Reth stood and gave a single sharp nod. The room erupted in cheers and stomping and clicking. The Gorvan students roared their approval. Reth had taken a level 5 and barely flinched. The sorry student went next. She was brave, and her aquatic biology was sensitive, and she made it to level 3 before her body began shaking, and she raised her hand to stop. She was trembling, and her fins were pressed flat against her body, but the room gave her respectful silence. Then a Velesi student tried and reached level 4, and Adranathi made it to level 3, and a young Gorvan cadet pushed to level 6, but screamed at the end and had to be helped from the chair. The rankings seemed clear: Gorvan on top, everyone else below, humans nowhere. Then Tavan stood up. He did not walk to the chair. Instead, he turned to face the room. And when he spoke, his crystal voice carried to every corner. If the data from Professor Almaran's lecture is correct, he said, then humans possess the most complex pain processing system in the known galaxy. We have heard claims about their endurance. We have seen one human perform under stress in a simulation. He paused, and his compound eyes swept the room until they found Kael sitting in the back row. As always, I propose we put the data to the test, he said. The room went quiet. Every head turned toward Kael. Professor Almaran, who was floating near the front in his containment suit, turned his silver gaze on Tavan. The look he gave the Velesi student was sharp and cold, but he did not intervene. He looked at Kael, and his voice was quiet. Choice is yours, he said. The silence stretched. Kael sat still for a long moment, and Silha, who was sitting 3 rows away, felt her chest tighten. She wanted to stand up and tell them all to leave him alone. She wanted to scream that they had no idea what they were asking, but then Kael shrugged. It was a small motion, barely visible, just a slight lift of his scarred shoulders. He stood and walked to the chair. Room was so silent that the sound of his boots on the metal floor echoed like a heartbeat. He sat down. The technician looked nervous. Her hands moved over the controls, and she glanced at Professor Almaran, who gave a slow nod. Level 1, she said. She activated the device. Kael did not react. Level 2, nothing. Level 3, whether the sorry had broken. Kael's expression did not change. His eyes stayed open and focused, and his breathing remained Steady level 4. Nothing level 5, where Reth had grunted and Flex Kael blinked. That was it. He blinked once like a speck of dust had floated past his eye. The room. Stirred whispers broke out among the students. Reth leaned forward in his seat, his massive body tense level 6. Kael's jaw shifted slightly. A tiny movement that no one would have noticed if they were not staring directly at his face, level 7. This was the level of the Catastrophe stalker from the simulation, the level that was supposed to incapacitate most species. Kael took a slow breath through his nose and let it out. That was all. The technician looked at the device, and then at the medical monitors, and then at Professor Almiron. Her face was pale. Continue, said Almiron. Level 8. For the first time, a muscle in Kael's neck tightened. His hands, which had been resting loosely on the armrests, closed into fists, but slowly, not in panic, in control level. A bead of sweat appeared on Kael's forehead. His knuckles were white now, and the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing, but his face was still calm. The technician's hands were shaking. She looked at the device, and the safety warnings were flashing on every screen level. 10, she whispered. She was not announcing it. She was reading it in disbelief, because Professor Almiron had nodded again. She activated at level 10, catastrophic tissue. Destruction equivalent. The monitors screamed. His heart rate spiked. His neural activity exploded across every scan. The amount of pain being fed directly into his brain was equivalent to being burned alive, while every bone in his body shattered. Simultaneously, Kael's hands gripped the armrests so hard that the metal bent. His jaw locked tight, and the muscles in his neck and shoulders turned to stone. A single drop of sweat ran from his temple down his scarred jaw and fell onto the chair. His eyes stayed open. He did not scream. He did not move. He did not make a single sound. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The technician shut it off with trembling hands. The room was dead, not quiet. Dead. There was no sound, no movement, no breathing. It was as if every living being in that hall had forgotten how to exist for a moment. Kael exhaled. It was a long, slow, controlled breath, and it was the loudest sound in the universe. He unclenched his fists, and his hands were shaking. That was the only sign. Only crack in the wall. His hands trembled as he placed them on his knees and pushed himself to standing. He stood, and his legs held. He turned and walked back toward his seat, and the sea of alien students parted for him, without thinking, without deciding. Their bodies simply moved out of his way, the way all living things move away from something they do not fully understand. As he passed Tivan, he stopped at Tivan, looked up at him, and for the first time the Valesi student had nothing to say. His mandibles were still. His compound eyes were wide. His crystal body was motionless. Kael looked at him, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and steady and carried no anger and no pride. It is not that I do not feel it. He said, I feel all of it. I just have something to compare it to. He walked to his seat and sat down. Tuvan's legs buckled, and he lowered himself into his chair like an old man. His exoskeleton made a faint cracking sound, which happened to Valesi only under extreme emotional stress. Reth stood. The massive Gorvan walked to where Kael sat, and the ground trembled slightly with each step. He stopped in front of the human and looked down at him with his deep ancient eyes. Then he reached out and placed one enormous clawed hand on Kael's shoulder. It was a Gorvan gesture called the Gorvshan. It meant, I see your war, and it was a sign of the deepest respect one warrior could show another. It was reserved for those who had endured what should have destroyed them. It had not been given to a Devan, to a non-Gorvan in over 1,000 years. Kael looked up at him and gave a small nod across the room. Scylla was crying. Her glow was shifting through every color her body could produce, and she did not care. Who saw she had felt what Kael felt during that test. She had felt the full force of level 10 pain through her empathic connection, and she had nearly passed out, but she had also felt the thing beneath it. The old pain, the 11 months, and she understood now that level 10, the maximum, the worst thing the device could produce was nothing to him, not because he could not feel it, but because he had. already lived through something worse, something so much worse that the machine could not even reach it. Professor Almiron floated forward and faced the silent room. Humans, he said, do not exaggerate pain. They have simply learned that the universe will not stop hurting them if they scream. He paused, so some of them stopped screaming. His silver form turned slowly, taking in every face in the hall. Do not mistake silence for absence. The quietest ones are caring the most. No one spoke, no one moved, and in the back row, Kael sat with his shaking hands in his lap and stared at nothing, and the pain inside him burned on the way it always had, the way it always would, like a fire that had forgotten how to go out. The explosion hit at 0347 station time, when most of the academy was sleeping. The orbital stabilizers failed first, and the entire station shuddered like a living thing in pain. Then the secondary power grid blew and the lights went dark, and the emergency alarms began screaming in every language the system knew. Red light flooded the corridors, and the floor tilted as the station's orbit began to decay. Sections began to depressurize. Bulkheads slammed shut, trapping students and staff in sealed compartments. The lower decks, where the first-year dormitories were located, took the worst of it. Ruptured plasma conduits vented superheated gas into the corridors, and the temperature in those halls climbed past the point where most organic tissue begins to cook. Fires spread. Toxic fumes filled the air, and somewhere in the lower decks, 312 students were trapped. The emergency crews mobilized, but they were overwhelmed. The station had never experienced a failure this catastrophic, and the rescue teams were designed for small-scale incident. Not this. The corridors leading to the lower decks were flooded with heat and poison, and no species on the station could survive. Extended exposure. The command center was in chaos. Officers shouted over each other, and damage reports came in faster than anyone could process them. A Gorvan emergency coordinator stared at the thermal readings from the lower decks, and his plated face went rigid. No one can get through that, he said. The ambient temperature is beyond survivable limits for any known species. We have to wait for the external rescue ships. How long? Someone asked. 4 hours. There was a silence, and in that silence, everyone in the room understood that 4 hours was too long. The life support in the lower decks was failing. The trapped students would suffocate or burn before help arrived. Kael was not in the command center. He was already moving. He had felt the first explosion from his quarters on the mid-deck, and he was dressed and out the door before the alarms even started. He moved through the darkened corridors with the calm efficiency of a man who had survived worse. He had survived 11 months in a dying ship alone. He had survived pain that would have killed most beings in the galaxy. A burning hallway was nothing. He reached the sealed bulkhead that led to the lower decks, and he could feel the heat radiating through the metal. The surface was hot enough to blister skin on contact. He pulled his jacket over his hands and worked the manual override. The door opened and a wall of heat hit him like a fist. He stepped through. Behind him he heard footsteps. He turned and saw Reth coming down the corridor at a full run. The massive Govan's eyes were fierce, and his plated body was already steaming from the heat. But he did not slow down. You are not going alone, he said. Behind Reth came Tavan, moving fast on his 6 crystal legs. His exoskeleton was clicking rapidly, which meant he was afraid, but he kept coming. Then Silha appeared at the end of the corridor. Her bioluminescence was blazing bright, cutting through the smoke and the darkness like a living beacon. She was terrified. Kael could see it in every flicker of her glow, but she was there. Kael looked at the 3 of them, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes, something that was not pain. He nodded. Let's go, he said. They went into the fire. The corridors of the lower deck were a nightmare. Plasma vented from cracked conduits in hissing streams, and the air was thick with toxic smoke that burned the lungs. The floor was buckled and warped from heat, and in places it was soft enough to sink into. Visibility was near zero, and the screaming of the alarms mixed with the screaming of the trapped students somewhere ahead. Kael led. He took the worst paths, the ones that were actively burning. He wrapped his face with torn cloth and moved through corridors where the temperature was high enough to melt plastic. His old scars seared, and new burns formed on top of them, and every step sent pain shooting through his body like electricity. He did not slow down. Rith followed close behind. The Gorvan's thick-plated skin protected him from the worst of the heat, and he used his massive strength to tear through collapsed bulkheads and blocked passages. When they found injured students, he picked them up 3 at a time and carried them like they weighed nothing. Tavan used his knowledge, his Velesi mind cataloged every injury he saw, and his precise crystal claws applied emergency medical aid with surgical accuracy. He sealed wounds. He stabilized broken bones. He kept beings alive who would have died in minutes without intervention. His fear was still there, clicking through his exoskeleton, but his hands were steady. Silha was their compass. Her empathic abilities could sense the fear and pain of the trapped students through walls and floors. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, and the emotions of hundreds of terrified beings flooded into her. It was overwhelming and agonizing, and she wanted to collapse, but she thought of Kael. She thought of 11 months alone in pain with no one coming, and she kept going. This way, she called out, her voice cutting through the smoke. Left corridor, 3rd door. There are 14 of them. They found the first group of survivors in a sealed classroom. Mostly the sorry students, their aquatic bodies drying out in the heat. Reth kicked the door down, and Tavan immediately began hydrating them with emergency supplies from a broken medical station. They found the second group in a collapsed dormitory. 22 students of mixed species huddled together in the dark. Silha guided them out while Reth carried the ones who could not walk, but the largest group was deeper in 40. 7 first-year students, mostly Dalvari younglings, were trapped in the main assembly hall. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and plasma was leaking from 3 different conduits. The temperature inside was lethal for Dalvari physiology, and their bioluminescence was fading, which meant they were dying. The only way in was through a corridor that was fully engulfed. Rith looked at it, and for the first time hesitated. Even Gorvan, Armorhead limit scale, did not hesitate. He went in. The fire closed around him, and his clothes began to smolder and then burn. His skin blistered, and the pain was extraordinary, even by his standards, even compared to the 11 months, even compared to the level 10 chair. This was real and immediate and consuming. But he kept walking. He reached the assembly hall, and he forced the door open with his bare hands, and the metal seared his palms down to the muscle. He fell through the doorway, and the Davari youngling screamed at the sight of him because he was burned and bleeding, and his eyes were wild with pain. But he was standing. He was still standing. He gathered the younglings behind him, and he positioned his body between them and the leaking plasma conduit. When a secondary explosion rocked the hall and a chunk of the ceiling came down, he threw himself over the smallest of them and took the impact on his back. Something cracked in his spine. Old injury, new damage. He did not scream. Lay there for a moment with his face pressed against the floor and every nerve in his body howling, and then he pushed himself up again because the younglings were crying and they needed him. So he sat against the wall with the children clustered around him, and he talked to them. He told them about Earth. He told them about blue oceans that stretched to the horizon and green forests that smelled like rain. He told them about a sky that changed color every morning and every evening. He told them about snow falling silent and soft and covering everything in white. He told them about the sound of wind through tall grass and the feeling of warm sunlight on your face after a long cold night. His voice was steady and warm, and the younglings stopped crying and listened, and their fading bioluminescence slowly began to return when the rescue teams finally cut through the wall and broke into the assembly hall. They found Kael sitting in a circle of Delvari children. His suit was melted to his skin in places. His hands were raw and red and shaking. His back was broken again, and his body was a map of fresh burns layered over old scars. But he was conscious. He was calm. He was telling the children about Rain. The lead rescuer was a Garvan military officer, decorated and battle-hardened, and he had seen things that would haunt most beings for a lifetime. But when he looked at Kael, he stopped. "How are you still conscious?" he asked. Kael looked up at him and smiled. It was a small, tired, broken smile. "Practice," he said. "The rescue took another 2 hours. All 312 students were saved. Not one was lost." Reth carried survivors until his own plates cracked from the heat. Tavan worked until his crystal claws were chipped and dull. Silha guided rescue teams until she collapsed from empathic overload and had to be carried out herself. But Kael was the last one out. He refused to leave until every youngling was safe. 1 month later, the academy held a remembrance ceremony. The great hall was full and every species was represented, and the silence was deep and respectful. Kael stood on the stage with Reth, Tivan, and Silha. He was thinner than before, and his new burns were still healing, and he stood with a slight lean because his back had not fully mended. But he was there. Tivan stepped forward and presented his thesis to the assembled faculty and students. Its title was A Recalibration of Pain Response, Hierarchies, and Why Silence is Not Absence. It would become the most cited student paper in the history of the Galactic Union. Akademirith stepped forward and faced Kael, and the hall went silent. In a voice like rolling thunder, he spoke a single word in Old Garvan Gorv. Kanet meant one who walks in fire and does not lie down. It had not been given to a non-Gorvan in over 1,000 years. Kael accepted it with a nod and said nothing, because what could anyone say to that? Later that night, Silha found him on the observation deck one last time. She sat beside him and took his scarred hand in hers, and this time the pain that flowed through their connection was familiar. She knew it now. She carried a small piece of herself from the fire, from the rescue, from everything they had been through together. But there was something new above the pain, like a light shining through deep water. There was something she had not felt before, purpose, not the cold survival instinct that had kept him alive for 11 months, not the mechanical endurance that had carried him through the chair and the jungle and the burning corridors, something warmer, something that had only appeared after he stopped being alone. She looked at him, and he looked at the stars. "Humans do not stop hurting," he said. "We just find reasons to keep going anyway." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and her glow was soft and steady and warm. The stars turned. Far below them, a new semester began. A fresh class of alien students filed into Professor Almerin's lecture hall, and they were young and loud and full of opinions. One of them, the sorry first year, made a joke about humans being fragile, and the class laughed from the back row. A crystal voice cut through the laughter. It was Tavan. Had not been scheduled to be in this class. He had already passed this course with the highest marks in a decade. But he was here. "Sit down," he said, and his voice was sharp and cold and carried the weight of someone who had walked through fire beside a human being. The laughter died. Tavan looked at the young students, and his compound eyes were hard. "Listen," he said, "and let me tell you about the quietest species in the galaxy." The class went silent, and somewhere on the observation deck above them, a human sat alone with his pain and his scars and his memories, and he looked at the stars, and he breathed, and the fire inside him burned on, not because it was destroying him, but because it was the only thing that ever proven he was still alive. And that was enough. That had always been enough. Galaxy had feared the humans who screamed in battle. It should have feared the ones who did not.